Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Megan Dooley, and I am here today to take part in the More Than My Brain Injury movement, which is part of Brain Injury Month, which is the month of March. Today, I'm going to be talking about what happens at a cellular level when there is a brain injury. And so in a previous video, I talked about how our brain functions when there is not damage or a typically developing brain. How does it work day to day? But today I'm going to talk about what happens if there is a traumatic brain injury, a stroke, or a non-traumatic injury such as a tumor removal. What does that look like for our brain function? So I'm going to talk about three different things today. I'm going to talk about something called excitotoxicity. I'm going to talk about how after the brain injury, those little neurons that we had talked about, how they regenerate or how they heal, because it is different than what we may think. And then I'm also going to talk about something called cortical reorganization, but don't worry, I will break that down for you. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is excitotoxicity. And this is something that occurs once that damage has initially happened. I'm just going to share my screen with you here real quick, so I can kind of give you an example of this. So let's say that there is damage to the brain. This could be a stroke, it could be a traumatic injury, or it could be that a tumor is pressing on an area of your brain, and this is what's going to occur. So the first thing that can happen is ischemia. And over here, I help to hopefully define some of these things. So ischemia is decreased blood or oxygen to that area of the brain. And we know that we need the stuff in our blood, which brings oxygen, but it also brings other things that are going to help to excite or turn off those different neurons and keep that electrical signal flowing. So once ischemia happens, glutamate, which you guys don't have to know what these things are, but glutamate is something that excites our neurons, or that electrical charge in our brain that sends signals on for us to be able to do things. Well, it's a great thing, but when we have too much glutamate, it can cause those neurons or those little electrical firing mechanisms to actually die. Why? Well, we'll talk about it here real quick. So when there is a lot of glutamate released, it activates things within our neurons. So the calcium channels, and there's three different things that can happen. So the first one over here, glycolysis. If you are anybody that took biology in college, you talked about glycolysis and lactic acid. And lactic acid isn't good for us when we run a lot. It makes our muscles sore and achy. Well, it also isn't good for our neurons, because with an increase in or a decrease in the pH level, it actually causes that neuron or that cell to die off. Okay, so that's one way that it can cause damage, is it's going to actually make the pH within that cell area or that electrical system too low, and it will kill off that neuron. Another thing that can happen over here is calcium can activate protein enzymes within the neuron, and that can cause us to create free oxygen. So it is charged, an electrically charged oxygen, and that can create nitric acid or nitric oxide, and that actually kills not only the mitochondrial function, but it also damages the neuron, which will cause that cell to die. So it's a break in that electrical current. Anywhere that we lose one of those neurons, we aren't connecting that circuitry, okay? And finally, something that we can probably relate to if we've ever had an injury to our body is an increase in swelling. And one thing that can happen when there's too much glutamate is that it increases that inner charge within the cell, and it increases our water within that cell. And as that cell swells, it isn't able to perform, because it's not able to send things down the axon because it is swollen and pushing on that area. We're actually going to look at this in a picture. So that causes cell injury and death. This ischemia, which is the first thing that occurs, because this is something that affects one neuron, which is going to affect that chain. So it's a break in our chain of information going out. It's why when somebody has a stroke or a traumatic brain injury or a non-traumatic brain injury like a tumor, is it extends out because that chain's broken. So it's not just where the chain breaks, it's all that extra information that from that point of damage on is not getting a signal or information. And so if we leave that untaken care of, it'll just continue to spread, right? But you know, if you go in after an injury and they can get your swelling down or can get some blood flow back by the removal of a tumor or a blood clot, then we have to work on what is next. What is going to happen with that recovery process? Now, when we're looking at the central nervous system, the interesting thing is if we remove or we stop some of this, the bummer part about our brain is that it doesn't regrow these neurons, okay? It doesn't just regrow them. So if there's damage to them, it can't regrow. That is something that does occur though outside of our brain, okay? Outside of our brain, our nerves, which are made up of neurons, can regenerate. They can regrow their signal, but in the brain, they're damaged, okay? So I'm gonna walk you through what is occurring in your brain when there's that damage happening, okay? And after that, what does that neuron do? How does that signal continue to get itself out there? So the first one here is edema, or that increase in water. So that pressure comes down and it pushes on that axon. And if you're able to catch the video before this, we know that the axon sends all that information down and out, and it is what releases that signal to keep going, to move my arm, to be able to talk, to keep my heart beating. But if there's something pressing on it, that signal can't get through. As long as that edema or that swelling, that extra water is removed, okay, that signal can continue to go on. So that's nice. That's why there's a lot of medical things that occur, whether it's, you know, removing part of the skull so the brain can swell out and come back in, there's room without damaging all of these neurons. Or it may be why they might cool your body down. They might give you, you know, different medications to help with this. So that's one of the first ones, okay? All right, let's see here. Okay, so then moving on to the second one here. When we're looking at another form of injury, so we're gonna look at that neuron again. So in this picture, what happens is this neuron is the one that is getting damaged, all right? So this neuron was damaged, and so this is helping to show the whole chain of events. This one's damaged, so it isn't sending anything out to this neuron. And what happens then is this neuron's looking for a signal or some information, and this one is dying off because it's been damaged to some degree. And so what it does, this one dies off, okay? And this one down here decides, you know what, I'm gonna add a lot more receptors. That's what all of these things are. So that any neuron around me, any one of these that's around this one, that's sending out those neurotransmitters that that one needs, it has more chance of picking them up. Okay, so it's not as effective as one-to-one. So this neuron's tied to this neuron, but by doing that, it's increasing the chances that hopefully it's gonna pick up some of those neurotransmitters it needs so that it can continue the chain. So this chain breaks right here, but there's a chain right here that's doing the same thing potentially. So this one adds extra receptors. So anything that's extra coming out of that one can attach and it can keep doing its job. And then we have this information going on here. So before injury to presynaptic cell, okay. In this situation here, you can see that there are 3 axons that are, or terminals that are releasing those neurotransmitters, which is what helps that signal keep going. And they all have 2 in this representation. So they're sending them out and they're getting connected, and then they're zooming out and keeping that information going. But this can be damaged as well. It can be damaged by that edema, by that swelling. And so some of these can get lost in an injury. So this is after the injury. They've lost some of those terminals. But what happens is those neurotransmitters, which are the little white dots, they decide that they're just all going to go into one terminal. So you can see here there's 4 instead of just 2. And so the way that the brain is trying to make up for that is giving more neurotransmitters, which is our information, to keep going or to help send out that signal. They're going to just pile them more into what is remaining, but these will not grow back, okay, or regenerate. Here we have the unmasking of silent synapses. And so what that means is these little receptors in here, they're not out doing any job right now. So in our day-to-day without a brain injury, sometimes we have things that are on reserve. They're not there unless we need them. Well, if there's damage to the neurons, they can actually be turned on. And so as you can see in this representation is that these were brought into full force so that they can actually collect as much information as they can to keep that network going. So there are 4 different ways that our brain can try to recuperate or keep a signal going, even if there's damage to the direct signal to signal, okay? And so the first one again is relieving that edema. It's going to keep going. The second one is looking at adding more of those receptors so that they can pick up information around them and keep helping to send that signal. The third one is if that axon or that terminal where those are released is damaged, that those neurotransmitters pile into the 1 or 2 that are left and release more neurotransmitters out to make sure that, or to hopefully help make that signal strong enough to continue on. And then finally, if there's damage and there's not enough receptors picking up those neurotransmitters, that cell, that neuron down the way, turns on more receptors and takes more information so that it can continue that signal. So it's very interesting. Our neurons in our brain won't rejuvenate, okay? They are not going to start producing a new axon. We're not going to grow a new neuron, but our neurons have a way of rewiring how they're going to be able to get that information through. Another thing that can occur is our cerebral cortex, or the main part of our brain, can actually reorganize its jobs and take up space. So in our brain, when we are developing, certain parts of our brain take on certain jobs. If you are somebody that is fluent in several languages, your language part of your brain may be, or your mouth may represent a larger part. If you are somebody who does a lot of activities with your hands, you knit, you sew, that part of your brain may be larger, may be more represented than your feet. Okay, because you're putting a lot of energy or a lot of those neurons, you're asking those neurons to do a bigger job with making your hands very fine-tuned and quick and fast. So if something happens to that area and it dies off, there is space for other parts of our brain to help take over and help to hopefully find a way to still do some of those tasks, even if it's not as efficient. So that's another way that can occur. It's called functional reorganization. And so it's just taking those parts that might be damaged and filling them in with ways to still be able to accomplish your daily tasks without that functioning part of your brain. So there is always, our body is very, very trained and adapted to trying to survive. And that is the way that our brain tries to survive. Is it the most efficient? We would hope that our neurons would just regenerate, that it was damaged and it finds a way to regrow and continue that chain. Put in a new wire and it's still the same. But that's not how our brain works. And our brain has to come up with kind of a strategic way to rewire with maybe not as much effectiveness. And so in the next video, we're going to talk about how that looks during rehab and why rehab is so important for those networks that are reconnecting in different ways to have you do activities and be involved in trying to retrain your arm to move or retrain your ability to speak. Because while you do that, those neurons that are taking over that job need that constant feedback that they're sending out the right information or too much of some information, or they're not getting enough information in from the network further down. And then our body can actually adapt to that and hopefully train itself to give that just right amount of information or neurotransmitters to keep that signal going and to keep that signal efficient. So we're going to talk about that in the next video, about how and why early intervention after a brain injury, a stroke, whether it's traumatic or non-traumatic, is so important to helping that process of those neurons taking over the job of the ones that have died and knowing how to do that job. All right, so have a great day, and we'll see you in the next video.